Welcome to Undercurrents, the new daily news show from Unheard. On today's show, we are going to cover the Biden Justice Department's decision on Wednesday to drop a 32-page bombshell indictment seemingly out of nowhere, charging 2 Russian citizens with felony violations of foreign lobbying and money laundering laws. Is this evidence of a sinister plot to completely remake public opinion in favor of Vladimir Putin? Did it work? The Russians, in this case, worked for RT, Russia's state-owned media outlet that's aimed at Western audiences. RT was sanctioned in the aftermath of Putin's 2022 Ukraine invasion. In the indictment, the DOJ alleged that a, quote, covert project of RT involved the 2 Russians funneling $10 million into a Tennessee media company run by conservative influencers who fight bitterly in the American culture war and express skepticism of America's support for the war in Ukraine. Descriptions in the indictment line up with Tenet Media, a small and relatively unknown backer of digital content across social media platforms. One way to put it is this: you might know many people affiliated with the company, but you probably don't know anything about their affiliation with the company. As you can see here, the language from page 7 of the indictment is repeated explicitly on Tenet's digital property. That implicates Lauren Chen, who founded the company with her husband, Liam Donovan. The 2 have not yet been indicted, which is somewhat interesting since the DOJ alleges they knew the money was linked to the Russian government and would thus violate felony foreign lobbying laws since they failed to register as agents. That's part of what the Russians were charged with, actually. Chen has more than 500,000 subscribers on YouTube and 500,000 followers on Twitter. She'd actually written for RT in the past. Now, where the story actually gets interesting is that Tenet's business model was paying a network of right-leaning influencers gobs of money to produce content. And those influencers each have pretty big followings in their own right. They include Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, and Dave Rubin, all 3 of whom have said, like the DOJ, they did not know RT funded Tenet. Benny and Dave both emphasized they were victims of the scheme should the allegations prove true. And that's where the media's victory lap here gets maybe a little silly. On Morning Joe, Senator Chris Murphy claimed the indictment showed Russia being, quote, deeply integrated with, quote, MAGA media. But the real story is probably much less serious. Our guest today is one of the few people willing to explain why that might be. Journalist Ken Klippenstein reports at kenklippenstein.com. Yesterday, he published a refreshingly sober assessment of the new indictment and Russian influence ops in general. Now, of course, remember to subscribe to the Undercurrents channel right here on your favorite podcast platform. And for the full version of this interview, over at undercurrents.tv. Ken, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, good to be with you.
Yeah, so the first question I have is, this indictment is really bad. It's embarrassing for Benny. It's embarrassing for Dave Rubin and Tim Pool. But is it really proof that Russia is successfully and significantly influencing conservative media? Is the DOJ overstating the case? Is the media overstating the case? How should we think about this?
Yeah, so there are 2 things at issue here. One is, does the Russian government fund and back and oversee influence efforts targeted at the U.S., including potentially at elections? Yes, I think the answer to that question is overwhelming. Whether or not the Justice Department can substantiate the claims advanced in its indictment, those claims resemble a lot of things we've seen over the years that they have done. And so I think that it's a credible complaint. But where it's not credible is in how it's been discussed, not just by the news media, but by the U.S. government as well. If you look at how they've framed this, they had a press conference by the Election Security Task Force led by Attorney General Merrick Garland and other top officials like FBI Director Christopher Wray and the Assistant Director of the DOJ, the National Security Director, gave a statement attached to the indictment in which he described what this operation was as psychological warfare against the American people. And I just thought it was so inflated and over the top. It's like, isn't it enough that it happened and that this is embarrassing and that and that, you know, they did it? Now you have to say it's psychological warfare? Benny Johnson, this brain trust of individuals that most people under the age of 60 don't consume or have never heard of. This is going to, you know, tip the scales, not just politically, but potentially electorally. I mean, it's so over the top. And I wish that the media would provide some context. So to give you an example of how hyperbolic I thought the coverage, not just the coverage, the government's own allegations were. So that assistant director of DOJ, leader of the National Security Division, he in his description, not just calling it psychological warfare, but in the complaint itself, it talks about the millions of viewers that these YouTube videos alone reached. And I saw the number, and just being a Twitter denizen myself, where they will blare the
That's
view
to put it
count
mildly. A Twitter denizen, a Twitter obsessive, Twitter addict.
They'll blare the view count of the posts. And so I've become very familiar with how posts perform just from those numbers. And I thought, wait a second, this figure of X million, I don't remember exactly how many million it was, that's not that high. So I thought, let's go look at my own Twitter. I pulled up my analytics. I realized I had gotten more views than this supposed psychological operation that was going to, undermine American faith in institutions.
Imagine the damage that you've done, Ken.
I would love to think that I'm some geopolitical force, but unfortunately, I think I'm just a guy that, like you said, spends a lot of time on Twitter, and because of that, has some amount of followers. But if one person, namely me and my dumb posts, can attract more views than this $10 million Russian operation can on YouTube, I mean, that kind of puts the whole thing into perspective. And I just wish the media would. I'm not saying don't prosecute violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I'm not even saying don't announce it or don't pat yourself on the back for doing it, but provide some sense of proportion so that people don't overreact and it doesn't have the effect, the extent to which these things can have the effect that Putin wants, which is to sow dissension and undermine faith in elections, is if you overreact to it and panic, which is what happens every time, whether one of these things is pointed at Trump or pointed at Biden or whomever. There's always this kind of panic and sensational coverage that's way out of perspective from what the actual effects are.
Well, and there's a good argument, I'm curious what you think about this, that's kind of Russia's point, right? They don't really need to pour gasoline on the fire of America's culture war or divisions over the war in Ukraine, but what they can do is get Merrick Garland to do exactly what he did do.
Exactly.
And I guess I wonder then why it is, from your perspective, the DOJ does speak in such inflated and dramatic terms about psychological warfare from Benny, if, in fact, to your point, Ken,
I love that sentence, psychological warfare from Benny.
From Benny, yeah. It's not really, in the grand scheme of things, it's almost defeatist. It's like, look at what the Russians have done to us, instead of, we are way too strong for the Russians to really make any difference in what's happening right now. Why go with the defeatist version of it if you're the DOJ?
Yeah, the point you're making is essentially the same one that the former CIA lead author of the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment, looking at the 2016 Russian interference in the election. That's basically the same point he's making. And it was amazing to me. I know the guy, so I just called him up and asked him what he thought about it. And he gave exactly the sober tone that I wish that the press would. And he's by no means a dove on Russia and Russian influence. I mean, that's his exact expertise. He was a Russia expert for the CIA. He cast a very skeptical view of the effects that these things would have, and also he went even further, arguing that you need to consider the knock-on effects of people invariably overreacting to this when you make the assessment that it's worth going after a Foreign Agents Registration Act violation case. And so he said, and what was amazing to me is this is not a marginal guy, and the rest of the media can reach out to him and interview him if they wanted to, or other people like him. And I included in the story a quote from National Security Council, former National Security Council Russia expert from the Obama administration, also not someone who's indifferent to Russian malign intentions. He said basically the same thing about disinformation operations and influence campaigns and the lack of efficacy. I think people see it in their own personal life. If you think back to the teacher that's trying to be epic and be cool, or like how do you do, fellow kids? Like, it's really hard to influence people that you're even if you're from their culture and you're in the country. Now imagine someone from another country who's a bureaucrat several layers beyond the kind of corny teacher or youth pastor or whatever that I'm talking about. And you've got someone like Putin or someone in the Russian Ministry of Defense or intelligence or whatever, and they're doing this. They're going to be even more out of touch, not coming from the culture. And so part of it is Russian incompetence, as we're seeing play out in their invasion of Ukraine, and inability to defeat this much smaller, weaker country. And then you apply that lack of competence to a very difficult task, which is influencing people that you're not from their culture. The likelihood of that being successful, even in the most modest sense, I mean, is pretty low. So, and I look back through. There's a very good scholarly study by the Pentagon-backed RAND Corporation into Russian social media influence operations. And they take the same view as these other guys that I'm describing, saying it was, I think the quote was, neither effective nor particularly well deployed. And so this whole subject matter, I'm not a denialist. It exists. They are doing it, and, they want to hurt us. But whether they can manage to do that is a very different question. I would encourage people to look back, not just at influence operations, but military operations generally, and how many failed attempts at all kinds of things you've seen, from the U.S. to Russia, in the Middle East. I mean, this stuff in general is hard to do. And in particular, something psychological like this is extremely hard to pull off in any sort of way that scales.
That's actually a fairly interesting point as well, in that Li Fong, your former colleague at The Intercept, as part of the Twitter files, found the United States government creating phony profiles aimed at propagandizing different countries. It's not something that we have forfeited, that we've just sort of given up in the so-called info war. We actually do this too.
Every country does it. I mean, and when we do it, we have euphemisms for it. We call it public diplomacy. When they do it, it's disinformation. But the reality is, every state is trying to advance its interests. Now, I would maintain that America's interests are probably preferable to, an authoritarian state like Russia's.
Bold,
but that being
bold claim.
I don't know.
No longer invited on Tucker.
Go out on a limb here. Yeah, exactly. But so there's there's a difference there, and there's a difference in the, I think, the how brazen they're going to be about it, because different countries have different cultures and different norms. But that being said, it's they call it information warfare. It's its own battlefield, and every state is participating. And I thought Trump honestly put it well when he responded to the Iran hack of his campaign. He said, quote, "Never a nice thing to do, but it was mostly open record stuff." And in an ironic way, Trump was like the most level-headed of an official I've seen. I mean, that's basically it. It's like, I don't like it. I would love for it not to happen. Never a nice thing to do. But what are you gonna? It's not worth losing your cool over,
So, do you have any theories about why Chen and Donovan, who are alleged to have been aware that this was foreign money, are not named in the indictment? There are all kinds of conspiracy theories already bouncing around the internet about that. But Ken, you've covered situations like this in the past. What do you think the most likely explanation is?
Yeah, so there's a tendency in the intelligence world where they're trying to bring something to court that's called gray mail. It's not blackmail, it's gray. The idea being, when you bring something to court, and if you name someone a conspirator, you have to produce evidence for that. And much of the intelligence community's evidence is secret. And so I'm not suggesting that they're necessarily guilty of anything. I'm trying to provide some general context to how the intelligence community approaches court issues. Even in the case when they're, as was described to me by former intelligence officials, they'll often indict Russians who are no longer here for the reason that they know they're not going to come to court and go to jail. They're in Russia, knowing that they won't be able to respond, and then they won't have to produce evidence. So the intelligence community, in an ironic way, is not able to use all this awesome power that it has in terms of the ability to, collect intelligence, because they don't want adversaries to be able to figure out what's called sources and methods. How did they find that information out? And as a reporter, when I'm reporting something, someone tells me something, it is really hard to characterize what you know without it getting back to the person that told you. And so the intelligence community has that problem on a much higher scale, since their sources if they're humans, can get killed. If it's signals intelligence, say they have a wiretap, and they say something that suggests that they got information from wiretap, then the target is going to stop using that phone or update the software or whatever it is. So because of all of that, it makes the intelligence community in general very reluctant to bring things to trial. All that being said, you never know, where if the DOJ has a sealed indictment or a superseding indictment that comes out later. And if you look at what Tim Pool said, assuming he's not trolling, he said he's going to cooperate with the FBI. They might find themselves over the course of the next several weeks in contact with people that are going to be willing to furnish information as human sources, and that could change the calculus about how they proceed from here. So what you've seen in the indictment, that may not be everything that's to come, but there is that there is that reluctance to ever do anything that is going to require them to produce information to the public.
Now, you've mentioned FARA a couple of times, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which has played an outsized role in U.S. politics, just like foreign lobbying, frankly, has played an outsized role in foreign politics over the last decade or so, especially since Donald Trump hit the scene, and revelations about Paul Manafort and, you could even go back to Tony Podesta, have come to light. Can you tell us just a little bit about FARA? And it's actually, I remember all the stories from Politico and other places about 5 years ago. Suddenly FARA is being enforced. It's this law that dates back to, I think it's World War II, and I think only one person had been imprisoned. Only several times had charges been brought, and only one person had been imprisoned over the course of the law's history. Can you contextualize FARA for us just in the last several years, and what it means that Chen and Donovan, the two Russians, are alleged to have violated it in this case?
Right. So what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to register with the Department of Justice if you are being paid by either foreign government or a foreign principal in furtherance of foreign political aims. And so what then ends up happening is that you have to show them where you're doing that. And you can actually go on the Justice Department's FARA website, and they have disclosures for, a lot of it will be, for example, like maybe the United Arab Emirates is putting out information that is arguing for, let's say, a missile defense system in the UAE to shoot down, I don't know, Houthi rockets or whatever. So if they give someone to promote that, if they pay someone to promote that in the U.S., you have to disclose not just that you're doing that generally, but specifically where you're doing that, so people can, it's like a label on food or something, so they can know what's going into it. Now, there has been historically, it infamously not enforced.
What do you make of, I think it was Merrick Garland actually, but the DOJ broadly coming out shortly before this indictment was dropped and saying there are new Russian efforts to influence the 2024 election. Russia is trying to interfere in the election. And then I think it was maybe the next day this indictment was dropped. A lot of people were kind of on the right, especially, laughing about that and saying, polls must look bad for Kamala Harris. They're blaming the Russians again. But to your point, yes, it's happening. B, the indictment also seems to have real information, and you earlier said whether the DOJ can substantiate it is a different question. Can you get into all of that? Basically, what is the DOJ doing here? Do you suspect there are political motivations, like a lot of people on the right do, given what happened back in 2016?
There's certainly stage setting, and I think people are seeing some of this theater, which is, the election security task force that I mentioned having this press conference where they're talking about all this and like I said before, describing it as psychological warfare and all these kind of things. But that is more of a national security, that's stage setting on the part of the national security kind of system to kind of get people to perceive, okay, they're serious about this now. They're really going after this stuff. But I don't see that as a partisan thing, because they were doing the same sorts of stuff. This is my frustration with a lot of the reporting on the burgeoning, counter disinformation efforts in the U.S. government, which I'm critical of, but which are much less partisan than I think people realize. Several of these agencies came to prominence during the Trump administration. Now, I'm not saying Trump was sitting there telling them to do this. But what that tells you is that these agencies kind of run on autopilot to a great degree, and these kinds of projects, a case like this, is probably months or even years in the making. As the saying goes, the gears of justice turn slowly. And so they have their own internal prerogatives, which I think are much more legitimate to criticize than the idea that this was some sort of coordinated political operation, which I just have very rarely seen to be the case, whether it's the military or the Justice Department. They certainly have their own bureaucracy with their own philosophy and their own outlook and incentive structures, but it's way less political than people imagine generally.
My last question is how you assess the media coverage, essentially, of this indictment. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning, but there's some smugness on Morning Joe the next day and all of the usual characters, but it's so interesting whenever you see the kind of lack of skepticism in the press towards an entity that historically the press exists to be skeptical of, sort of the point, but it's kind of now taking the narratives and parroting them. So how do you assess the coverage in the last couple of days?
Well, yeah, I think the press is supposed to give people context and help them to understand what's going on and not just kind of thumb their nose and laugh at it, which is I'm even someone that finds aspects of this funny. I mean, like Tim Pool in the beanie. I'm just picturing him with like wearing a wire under it or something. Now that he's talking to the FBI. I mean, there's definitely a comic aspect to it.
Is that the origin story of the beanie? Because he was wandering around Occupy back in 2011.
Yeah, that's right. We finally know. But when they don't provide people, like I was saying before, if you're some boomer sitting at home reading this and you're not terminally online, like our generation is, you see 10 million views, you're going to think, wow, 10 million people change their mind. They don't understand that a TikTok will get 10 million views every day, a single one. They don't get that. And so how hard would it be to provide a single sentence being that's not an insignificant number. However, it's also a number that you see all the time and is dwarfed by, other entertainers and things. How hard would it be? Just one sentence. And that's just one example. They never provide that kind of background. I
was actually just going to say, subscribe to Ken's Substack. I love Ken's Substack. It's kenklippenstein.com. And where else can people find your work, Ken?
I'm on Twitter as well. And we run a Twitter account now called Clip News, where we post shorter form stuff that perhaps doesn't justify the blast out to our 60,000 subscribers on the Substack. But yeah, our main channel is Substack, so reach out to me there.
Awesome. Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Well, it's always important to be skeptical. In fact, this was the sort of job of media, to be skeptical of narratives coming out of the government. So it was great to have Ken here to provide the context that he mentioned. It doesn't mean going in one partisan direction or the other. It just means adding the proper context so people who you trust are smart enough can make decisions up for themselves. It's one of the tendencies of contemporary media, is feeling the need to talk down to and handhold everyone to the correct sort of ideological conclusion. So it was great to have Ken Klippenstein here. If you've been watching Undercurrents since we launched just over a month ago, what we started doing this week is turning this into a daily news show where we talk to one interesting person on one undercurrent every single day, because what we've learned is there's so much news to cover in this particular election cycle that being here every single day is the place we want to be. So join us. Undercurrents.tv is where you can see the full unedited versions of these interviews that we're doing with people like Mary Harrington, Ken Klippenstein, and Aaron Sparium on a daily basis. Otherwise, please make sure to subscribe to the Undercurrents YouTube channel. It helps us so much if you leave comments, if you leave reviews, and if you subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts as well. I'm Emily Jashinsky, your host here at Undercurrents from Unheard. We'll be back on Monday, which is very exciting, with more Undercurrents. Have a great weekend.